Let me remind you that there are microphones right up towards the front here for asking questions after the lecture is over. And now I'd like to introduce you to the book editor for the Los Angeles Times, Mr. Jack Miles.
Thank you. I thought I would begin my remarks about Mr. Wolfe this evening by pointing out that all authors hate their publishers. This is commonly known, less commonly known, but I will reveal it this evening, since I am no longer a book editor, but only a book review editor, is that most publishers return the favor. Any of you who entertain doubts on this score are invited to drop in on the American Booksellers Association convention in San Francisco at the end of this month and listen in on some of the conversations. I mention this because our speaker this evening, among the many other claims to fame that he enjoys a small one in New York, a secure but modest reputation as not a bastard. I have had conversations with several of his editors and publishers over the years, and together they constitute something of an exception to the rule that publishers hate authors. So take it as established then that our speaker this evening is a lovable fellow. But I hear you cry, what do we care about that? Nice guys finish last, and so on. Well, it is true that a speech that might begin, Tom Wolfe is a very good man, would tend to proceed to some vast dismissal of his talent, but no such dismissal is in store for you. I would like to praise Mr. Wolfe's work, and that on two counts, the form and the content. In form, Tom Wolfe's work constitutes a refutation of Strunk and White's Elements of Style, than which no book of comparable size has exerted so baneful an influence over American letters. The advice offered to you, and I sense from your reaction that it has indeed been offered to some of you by that book, is to be understated at all costs. But my dear friends, in what city do we find ourselves? This is not an understated city. And leave Los Angeles, and where do you find yourself? In Dallas, in New York. This is not an understated country. This is not Denmark. And we have lived through it some decades in the past, an industrial revolution. We are not surrounded now only by natural fabrics and home-hewn kitchen utensils. In my dreams, I imagine E.B. White standing face to face with the candy-colored tangerine flake streamlined baby, struggling for words. And as he struggles, I imagine Tom Wolfe coming to him with the words. I would like to quote a particular example and try to make it particular of what the great power of this style is. On the opening page of From Bauhaus to Our House, I'm sure that there must be some, by the way, some play on vowels here. If we were all from Dorchester, we might say from Bauhaus to our house, or slide it all into one vowel. The third paragraph on the first page of that book is as follows. Every new $900,000 summer house in the North Woods or on the shore of Long Island has so many pipe railings, ramps, hob-tread, metal spiral stairways, sheets of industrial plate glass, banks of tungsten halogen lamps in white cylindrical shapes, it looks like an insecticide refinery. I once saw the owners of such a place driven to the edge of sensory deprivation by the whiteness and lightness and leanness and cleanness and bareness and spareness of it all. They became desperate for an antidote, such as coziness and color. They tried to bury the obligatory white sofas under tie silk throw pillows of every rebellious, iridescent shade of magenta, pink, and tropical green imaginable. But the architect returned, as he always does, like the conscience of a Calvinist, and he lectured them and hectored them and chucked the shimmering little sweet things out. I draw your attention to the multiplication of words here. Pipe railings, ramps, hob tread, metal spiral stairways, sheets of industrial plate glass, banks of tungsten halogen lamps in white cylindrical shapes. This isn't happening by accident. This is the world in which we live. These are the objects that we move among and that ought to be feeding our imagination. But our imaginations for a long time were starved of just this nourishment, and it is through this writer that some of that nourishment has begun to reach us. So much for form. Content. Carl Jung once pointed out that after the disenchantment, the desacralization of the heavens by astronomy, men of our day turned in search of mystery, fearful mystery, to society. It was from the masses, from the depths of society, that world wars sprang, or riots, or fearful social disruptions. And it is true that those who can proceed somehow into these uncharted regions and bring back reports are heard as prophets were of old, or seers. And Tom Wolfe has done some of that, but what strikes me about his work is that he has proceeded upward as well as downward. It isn't only from the ghettos that strange and wild forces erupt. It's also from the boardrooms and from the campuses. And as the very book I just mentioned might be taken as an example of, he can find an obscure ism, a movement very scholarly, very learned, very technical, and show how it has transformed the very streets we walk down. In this regard, in the exposure of social disruption coming to us from on high, I can only say that I sleep better knowing that others sleep less well, knowing that Tom Wolfe is watching them. Please join me in welcoming and settling in for an enjoyable evening with Tom Wolfe.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so very much, Jack Miles. I will try to oblige with as much overstatement as possible. I am moved to talk to you tonight about something I have postponed writing about for a very long time, but which I now, for reasons that I hope will soon become blazingly obvious, am very sorely tempted to write about. And that is about my experiences when the Washington Post sent me to Cuba during my newspaper days. At the time, this was 1960. It was 1 year after the Cuban Revolution, 1 year after Fidel Castro had come to power. There were signs that the Cuban Communist Party was beginning to have quite an influence in the Cuban government. There was signs that Cuba was beginning to drift into the Soviet orbit. And so the Washington Post, in its wisdom, decided that there should be a Latin American correspondent sent from, first one in the history of the Washington Post, should be sent down to Cuba. Now, their choice of me is like something from right out of Evelyn Waugh's book Scoop, if you remember that book. In Scoop, the London Daily Express, which in Waugh's book is called the Daily Beast, decides to send the noted author John Boot to the country of Ismailia in Africa, which has been racked by revolution. Through a clerical error, they instead sent an obscure rural gardening columnist named John Boot. that was more or less the way I was chosen to go down to Cuba for the war. I was in my 20s. I was a young general assignment reporter. The kind of stories that I covered every day for the Washington, I filled in on other people's beats most of the time. A lot of the times on the police beat. I spent most days covering the most recent holdups at the liquor stores, the dry cleaning establishments, and the High's ice cream outlets. I mean, there's at least 3 High's ice cream stores were held up every night in Washington, D.C. On a really big day, the Post would send me out to cover an escaped ape story. There was a rash of these things. On one occasion, they sent me out to Oxon Hill, Maryland, to do a story on a Chambezi gibbon that had gotten loose from somebody's house or somebody's pet. I arrive out there, and sure enough, here's this ape going hand over hand down telephone wires. It wasn't a bad story, actually. I discovered there was somebody else in the neighborhood, this little neighborhood of $18,000 houses as it cost in those days. One of them had a tapir. I couldn't believe it. I don't know if you've seen a tapir. It's like a cross between a rhinoceros and a hamster. It's a big, great, flabby beast. Another family had an aquarium full of carnivorous fish, and they'd throw it these big cylinders of dog food into the, take it in, but nevertheless, I tried to see something good in this kind of story, but that's the kind of story that I was covering for the Washington Post. Well, the way I was selected to go to Cuba happened as follows. The Post, even then, but it was before computers were in common use, was the most organization-ridden newspaper I had ever worked for in all my days on newspapers. It was like Monsanto Chemical or the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company with printing presses. That was the kind of the nature of the Washington Post. And to get a job there, you had to take these batteries of motivation tests. One of them I remember was the tweezer dexterity test. They put you in a little room. There's a lucite box filled with white marbles. It has a little slot in the bottom of the box. They give you a pair of eyebrow tweezers, those metal eyebrow tweezers, and they give you 5 minutes to remove all the marbles from the lucite box. And every time you grab a white marble, it would squirt out of the tweezers. And so after about 2 minutes of this, and you're just sort of sweating BBs, and you're saying, look, all I want is a job, $95 a week as a reporter. What am I doing this for? Well, it was supposed to be a test of your powers of perseverance and so on. Well, this was the kind of newspaper it was. Well, it came time to choose someone to go down to Cuba, and they offered the assignment to all of the 10 highly touted, much vaunted members of the national staff of the Washington Post, the elite of the Washington Post. These were all men in their late 40s, early and late 50s, who by this time had built homes near the part of the government that they covered, up on Capitol Hill or out near the Pentagon. And none of them wanted to go to Cuba, relocate, go down to this godforsaken place. So they went through their voluminous files and indexes, and they came up with this one employee who had had 4 years of Spanish, myself. Now, they didn't realize that my 4 years of Spanish had all been aimed towards enabling me, like other students in those days, to read Don Quixote in the original. It had nothing to do whatsoever with spoken Spanish, but I somehow omitted telling them this because this was the assignment of my career. So off I'm going. I hadn't even thought about international relations. I worked nights. I had never thought about the subject. So I tried to decide what is the proper way that I should dress, for example, to cover a revolution. What do you do? So I figured, well, it's Cuba, it's the tropics. So I went down there with 2 white suits and a straw bota, the kind of those flat, hard straw hats, the kind of thing that they had the barbershop quartet wears. So I'll never forget the moment I arrived in the Havana International Airport, and I was coming down the ramp off the airplane, and suddenly this cry goes up, "Rudy Valley! Rudy Valley!" And I looked down, and it's ground crewman at Havana International Airport. Rudy Valley was a singer whose career ended so long ago, I had never heard his voice. I had never heard him sing. I knew who it was. But apparently he had just made a hell of a hit in Havana. And he wore a straw bota, and so as I came down in my white suit and my straw bota, this cry of Rudy Valley goes up. Well, for days after that, everywhere I would go trying to cover the Cuban Revolution, every street I walked down, the cry would go up, Rudy Valley! Rudy Valley! It was not exactly the way for a foreign correspondent to blend into the scene, but as I say, I was rather green, but the only reporter that I ran into who was more out of the picture in Cuba at that time than I was a man named Logan Gourlay, who was a entertainment columnist for the real London Express. It seems that he had been here in Los Angeles and had interviewed Irving Wallace after Wallace had written his book, The Chaplin Report, which was about sex, was a novel about sex in the suburbs. And this column had made a great hit in London. So he received a cable here in Los Angeles saying, proceed to Havana. We want story on sex life of Fidel Castro. Our readers tired of the usual political diet. So Gourlay, what difference is it to him? He gets on a plane, he goes to Havana. And so I met him very early in the game. And every time he'd get into a taxi cab, here would be Gourlay. He dressed very nattily, like a real Soho London Sharpie with the exaggerated spread collar and the little Windsor knot and with the shepherd's check tie and the rest of it. He'd get into a cab and he'd say to the driver, I say, what do you think of this fellow Fidel Castro? And the driver would say, oh, he's a great man, senor. He's a great man. And then he'd kind of wink at the driver and say, I bet he's a bit of a rip too, isn't he? Kind of a and the driver would say, rip, senor? And he'd say, well, you know, a sport. He kind of likes a good time, likes a little spot of fun. Isn't that a fair statement? And, well, I suppose so, senor, the guy would say. And he'd say, I bet he has an eye for the ladies, doesn't he? Kind of a little gleam in the eye there. And he'd say, what about his love life? And then the driver would always get a little wary and say, what do you mean? What are you talking about? He says, come on, fellow, tell me about this. What is the sex life of Fidel Castro? And at this, the driver would invariably be furious and would blow up. I mean, and would just shut up and really start to create. But Gourlay was really fireproof, and he never, he would, every time this happened, it happened over and over again. He'd say, touchy lot down here. Well, so finally one night Gourlay, myself, and a couple of other journalists ended up in the house of Ruby Hart Phillips, who was a New York Times correspondent in Havana at that time. And at the table was a man named Ted Scott, who was the CBS correspondent in Cuba. And somebody says, well, Mr. Gourlay, what brings you to Havana? He says, I got this cable from my office when I was in Los Angeles. Said to come down here to do a story on the sex life of Fidel Castro. Maybe you folks can help me out a little bit. Before he got that last sentence out, every old hand in Havana at the table had dropped his silverware. There was a great clatter, and Ruby Hart Phillips said, shut up, for God's sake, my servants are probably working for the secret police. And this began to shake Gourlay up a little bit. And Ted Scott, the CBS man, said, Mr. Gourlay, you didn't by any chance bring that cable with you to Havana, did you? And he said, yes, it's in my hotel. He said, if I were you, I would get right over to my hotel, over to the Nacional. I'd take that cable and I'd either burn it or I'd flush it down the toilet. I certainly wouldn't leave it lying around my room. This kind of shook Gourlay up. So he went back to the hotel, and sure enough, the cable was gone. Well, the next day, I ran into another journalist, and he says to me, did you hear what happened? Did you hear what happened to Ted Scott? And I said, what? He said, they picked him up, the DIER, that was the initials for the military intelligence, actually. They picked up Ted Scott, they put him in jail, him and some Englishman. And I said, oh my God, Gourlay. And I knew Ted Scott had a lot of friends, and there'd be a lot of people working on his case, but I figured there was nobody looking out for poor Gourlay. So I took it upon myself to go around trying to find the British consul. There was no ambassador there at that time. And I finally found the British consul. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Guy was 3 sheets to the wind. I tell him what has happened. He says, those bloody bastards from the Express always come down here and cause trouble, don't they? So well, that's kind of it for Gourlay. So I really began to worry about the guy. Well, the next morning, after I spent a day doing all of this, there's a knock on my hotel door at the Havana Hilton Hotel, soon to become the Havana Libre, where there were only 12 tourists in Havana by this time. So everybody had a suite if you wanted. I had this big suite. I was making $110 a week. I was living like someone who was making $200,000 a year in the suite overlooking Havana Harbor. At the door are three young men, or boys really, about 17 or 18, 19 years old. They say to me, "Are you Mr. Wolfe?" And I say, "Yes." And they said, "We are from the, what you might call the Cuban FBI." They produced their wallets with their ID, the pictures. And I look at these pictures, and here are three people with beards down to here. All three of these young men are absolutely clean-shaven. So I look at the picture, I look at them, but I didn't put too fine a point on this because each one of them happened to have on his hip a .45 revolver. You know, it's about a foot long. So sitting there like that was kind of, under the circumstances, ID enough. Well, it turned out that, in fact, these young men had all been barbudos, the bearded ones, those who had been in the Sierra Maestra with Fidel fighting during the revolution. It was a great mark of honor to be one of the bearded ones, one of the barbudos. But the barbudos had become such an elite group that Fidel had enunciated a ukase that said they had to shave off the beards. They were becoming elitist. So they had done so, but they couldn't bear to give up the ID that proved that they had been in the mountains. Well, this was kind of the atmosphere there. Even when you were, well, anyway, they came into my room. They started asking me, and they said, "Mr. Wolfe, do you by any chance know a journalist named Logan Gourlay?" And I said, "Well, yes, I know Mr. Gourlay." And they said, "Are you by any chance working here with him?" And I said, No, I'm not. Geopolitics is my beat," I said. World tensions, splits among the hemispheres, this kind of thing. You know, the sort of thing that Washington Post, you know, Washington Post. They went on to start, they began to ask me more and more questions about Gourlay, but I could see they really weren't very serious about all of this. They stayed in the room about an hour, and first thing I know, each one of them has gone into this big marble bathroom. Each one of them flushes the bidet. Obviously, they'd never seen one before. I hadn't either, to tell you the truth. They were illegal in the U.S. at that time. They're all in there flushing the bidets, and then they go out to this big terrace. They'd slide these glass doors back and forth. They'd all take seats in this white leatherette terrace furniture out there. They went through everything in the place. They loved this suite. You know, it was just a fabulous land to three boys who'd probably come from the countryside and spent a lot of time growing a beard up in the mountains. And they did a bit of that, and they finally left. But before they did, I heard two of them that were behind me. They were speaking sotto voce to one another, and one of them says, "Rudy Valley." They had just found the straw bodo, which was up on a shelf, you know. Back there. Well, anyway, they left, and I survived. And even though I'd had my brush with the secret police, and something had happened to Logan Gourlay, and one thing and another, there was something about the Cuban Revolution that always had a comic side to it. There was always it was kind of a burlesque quality to so many things that it really reinforced the notion that there was no possible way, even if, in fact, the Cuban Communist Party was becoming stronger within the Cuban government, that these people could be regimented. And you heard that over and over again. There was no possible way to regiment the Cuban people. They were too independent. They were too fun-loving. They were too easy come, easy go. They were too passionate. They were too individualistic. And just their humor and their colorful and unpredictable quality. Incidentally, a lot of this was kind of condescending, but would make it impossible for anyone to impose a Marxist-Leninist regime on the Cuban people. And I must say that was the way it seemed to me also. After that, day after day, this notion would be reinforced. One time I went out to the airport to cover the arrival of the Canadian foreign minister. A Cuban band comes out to the airport to meet, along with dignitaries, to meet the Canadian foreign minister. When the band gets there, they suddenly realize they don't know the music to the Canadian national anthem. So they run. The whole band just starts running. And to this day, I can still see them going around a corner of a hangar out at the Havana International Airport with these tubas and trombones and sousaphones and French horns bouncing up and down like this as they disappear behind the thing. And you say to yourself, how can this be called a Marxist-Leninist communist revolution? I also saw a member of the Cuban cabinet, a cabinet minister, receive a Soviet delegation while standing on his head. He was a yoga enthusiast. And for 30 minutes, he received an official delegation from the Soviet Union. There were these Russians going up to him with holding pieces of documents upside down, so, to get him to look at it. And he was still standing on his head when they left the room. You know, so much for Soviet influence in Cuban life. Castro at that time promulgated in rapid succession 3 extremely popular laws. These were really ukases. The first one was called the Law of Parking Meters. It would say, henceforth there will be no more parking meters in Cuba, and that you may do what you want with the parking meters that now exist. And people had a great time. There were a lot of baseball bats in Cuba. They came out, they were just whacking, they were knocking their heads off the parking meters, and just the kind of thing we've all wanted to do, particularly in it was a very popular thing. The second ukase was that starting tomorrow, that's the way the thing, starting tomorrow, everyone's rent is cut in half. Very popular move. The third, as I say, these came one after another. The third was that henceforth no one working in Cuba could be fired so long as that person showed up at his or her job. As long as you showed up for work, you could not be fired. So one night, I decided to go to the Tropicana nightclub, which was still functioning. There was an enormous picture of George Raft still outside the Tropicana in 1960. Under the aegis of George Raft, I entered. The Tropicana was a room about the size of this hall, perhaps even slightly bigger. It was like something out of the most grand luxe Busby Berkeley musical ever done in Hollywood. There were terraces of tables with white damask tablecloths just flowing down to the stage. And the same 12 tourists you saw everywhere, including myself, were there. There were gaming tables, and there were so few people placing bets at the gaming tables, they didn't even go through the charade of spinning the wheel and the rest of it. The money went down. It was just, pulled away. It was like no more pretense. It was kind of the honest revolution. And up on the stage were a kind of Rockette corps of dancing girls, just like the Rockettes at Radio City in New York. There were 36 dancers. There was a full band for 12 people in the audience sitting at these tables. The band starts, and the Cuban Rockettes start their number. I'm watching. On the first beat, 36 legs go this way. On the next beat, 35 legs go this way. I'm staring at this. 36 go this way. 35 go this way. There's a gap, like a gap like a tooth missing from the mouth. As you look at this line of things, and I looked closely. I saw that one of the dancing girls had a cast from her hip down to her ankle. She's being held up by her. They put their arms around each other like this. And the idea was, if you showed up for work, you got paid, and you couldn't be fired. It was marvelous. And this was the kind of this was the mental atmosphere of the Cuban Revolution, and it made it impossible to think that anything very serious or very severe could go on. And there was a lot of talk about communism, about Marxist-Leninist principles, and so on. But the feeling you really had was that here were a lot of young men, and it's difficult to remember today how young the leaders of the Cuban Revolution were. They were young men. Fidel himself was about 34 years old, as I remember, in 1960. He ran around town with a bottle of Metaxa brandy in one hand, a Romeo y Julieta cigar in the other. I mean, it was just fabulous. He wasn't all that much older than I was, and to see this guy living life to the fullest. Speaking of the sex life of Fidel Castro, so there was a great debate as to what his sex life was actually like. It was known that he had the 30th floor of the Havana Hilton Hotel. Some said he had a harem in the tradition of the caudillo, of sort of Latin machismo. Others said that he was completely under the thumb of a rather shrewish Cuban communist named Celia Sanchez, and that he had no sex life left at all. You know, she was just kind of leading him around. The great debate about this. Nevertheless, he was one of the most colorful figures in world politics, and the whole world was watching. In the midst of all this, it was really difficult to see anything very sinister. The first indication I had that there might be a little bit more to this was one day I'm walking down one of the main avenues of Havana, and I see about 300 people out in front of a tall office building, about 300 people out on this plaza, people everywhere from 17 years old up to about 70, it appeared to me, men, women, in every kind of shape and form you can imagine, all out there doing side straddle hops in unison. Here's 300 people going, like, you know, office workers out here at 10:30 in the morning. There's a kind of a gym director type out there with a great build and a white T-shirt leading the troops. And suddenly it occurred to me, it was a comic spectacle in a way, but what would it mean if you were an office worker and you were told that at 10:30 in the morning you had to go down the street and do your calisthenics? Everyone in that office building had been ordered to go down to the street every day at 10:30 and do calisthenics in the name of the revolution. It occurred to me that something rather strange was going on here. Then I noticed something that I must say that I didn't find anyone else in the press corps noticing, and that was the promulgation of the law of organizations, which was a great deal more serious than the law of employment, the law of rents, and the law of parking meters. I was a religious reader of the Cuban press at that time. Since I really couldn't speak the language, I ransacked the papers every day. I could read them. And the papers in Cuba, there were still some non-government controlled newspapers. I think there were about 2 of them. They were for the revolution, but they were not controlled by the government. Most of the newspapers there were about 6 or 7 papers, were government controlled newspapers. And the government controlled newspapers were what is known as action papers. They were not so much to distribute news as to deliver political instruction to the populace and to various organizations as to how to proceed in this and that front. And it was in one of these papers that I ran across the law of organizations, which said that within 30 days, every organization in Cuba had to provide the minutes of the meetings for the past 5 years and a full financial accounting, complete records of the organization for the past 5 years within 30 days. If they were unable or unwilling to do this, they would be immediately and summarily dissolved and replaced by a revolutionary organization. This applied to everything from the Chamber of Commerce, which existed there, and the labor unions, down to glee clubs, stamp clubs, choral groups, the smallest sort of cultural organizations that you can imagine. And this transformation of the organizational life of this country from a motley medley of independent organizations to a complete tableau of government-controlled organizations took place overnight and was hardly noticed at all in the American press. And there was a very strong labor union, a labor movement rather, in Cuba, quite independent. It was not at all under the thumb of the old Batista regime. The hotel that I was in, the Havana Hilton, was in fact owned by the hotel workers union, run by the Hilton people, but is actually owned by the hotel workers union. That labor movement was wiped out overnight. After that, something that was decidedly sinister began to happen, and that was that Cuban friends of mine and acquaintances that I had made in Cuba began disappearing. And today we know what happened to them. They disappeared into what we now know was the Cuban Gulag, the concentration camps. The word Gulag wasn't even in the language at that time, and there was no hint at that time that there was any such thing as concentration camps in Cuba. Of course, today we know that they were there, and that into those camps went not only political dissidents, many intellectuals, artists, writers, many homosexuals, or people who were thought to be homosexuals who were deemed to look like homosexuals were put into these concentration camps. And we also now know that Cuba was not being, as was often said at the time, pushed into the Soviet orbit by the United States or any other country, but had decided early in the game that that was the orbit that they were in, because the government became more and more frankly a Marxist-Leninist government, and that is, of course, the only orbit that was really available to them at that time. Now, I am reminded of all this, of the good times and the more menacing times, by what is occurring today in Nicaragua. The similarities are so numerous. The idea, we hear over and over again that the Nicaraguans are a colorful, easy come, easy go, catch as catch can people who cannot possibly be regimented. That there's a kind of colorful, bumbling quality to the attempts of these young men running a revolution to make the future work in the name of the overthrow of the detested Somoza regime, which is so similar to the detested Batista regime. And we're told that they're far from being a closed society, that there is that the press from the United States can go easily into Nicaragua, and well, we could go easily into Cuba back in those days. We're told that there is a free press still exists. There are 2 newspapers in Nicaragua that are not government controlled, and we are told that that these are young men with vision, and you have to give them time. You can't keep accusing them of being Marxist-Leninists and so on. Unfortunately, of course, the Nicaraguans do not have anyone as colorful as Fidel Castro, so as a result, Ortega, their leader, is cast as a kind of Woody Allen figure who goes around in a dirty raincoat, and he has a mustache sort of like a proprietor of a shopping mall shoe store, and there's something sort of young and winsome about this young man, and yet the Nicaraguan government itself calls itself Marxist-Leninist, but it has become really something quite impolite in discussions of the Nicaraguan regime to refer to it in this country as communist, as Marxist-Leninist, or anything of that sort. There's something rude, there's something gauche about, they mention it, but in discussions here, there is something unseemly. There's something Philistine about referring to it as a Marxist-Leninist, government. God forbid that anyone should use the word communist to it. Now, the point I want to make tonight is not to establish anything. I don't know that much about it, about the Nicaraguan regime, other than to say the signs all point in one direction, but about the attitude in this country among writers, among artists, among faculties at our great universities, among all those people who we now think of as commentators or intellectuals, toward this business of socialism in our time, or towards Marxism-Leninism. I must apologize in advance. There's going to be a certain amount of rudeness and bad taste in this lecture. I somehow cannot avoid the terms if I'm to get across the meaning that I'm going to. But it is definitely bad form to bring up this strange, the somewhat strange subject. Even if we know, as we now know, that there have been real pogroms in Nicaragua against the Mosquito Indians, who've been driven from their homelands, great loss of life and great loss of property. And even though there has been a law of organizations promulgated in Nicaragua, and one of the first casualties was the independent Nicaraguan labor unions, the Confederación de Unificación Sindical and also the Central de Trabajadores de Nicaragua have both been dissolved and replaced summarily overnight by the Central Sandinista de Trabajadores. These things have occurred. We know that they have occurred, but it is still grossly impolite to mention the subject of Marxism-Leninism. Now, why? What is this? What is it? Now, I'm not talking about the Nicaraguans now. I'm talking about our own Our own commentators. What is it about our own commentators that make them so loath to be as gauche as I'm going to be tonight? What is it? Well, in its extreme form, there is the attitude of someone like William Kunstler, who has many times said that no progressive person should criticize a socialist regime, even if that regime is known to be repressive. And his thinking is that socialism is the hope of the future of mankind. We have to give it a chance. There are going to be mistakes. Wrong roads are going to be taken. But it's a gross mistake to criticize socialism as it heads down the road in the 20th century. But I think that is an extreme view. Far more typical, and the one that I think we should think about is the tendency to sever socialism, Marxism, Leninism, communism, that subject, from these regimes once they begin to look not as good as they did at the outset. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. There is a writer for the Village Voice in New York named Jack Newfield. Jack Newfield has modeled his career after those of Lincoln Steffens, Haywood Broun, and George Orwell. If he's going to do that, it would help if he did not have a prose style that sounds as if he had a flowered potholder on each hand, and particularly if you're going to be like George Orwell. But anyway, it's a perfectly respectable ambition. He, every now and then, in the interest of journalistic honesty, Jack Newfield, unlike most journalists, feels the compulsion, if necessary, to make a confession. He has kind of confessional fits from time to time. My favorite happened just a few years ago when Bella Abzug was running for Congress, one of the elections, and Jack Newfield made a confession that he had distorted reports, had distorted facts, had rearranged the natural order of occurrences and one thing and another in order to help her win the election. But he confessed this, and the title of the piece, as I remember it, was "I Told Lies for Bella Abzug." Now, I always loved that title because it reminded me of my favorite book, but I think it's the absolutely best book ever written about Howard Hughes, which was called "I Caught Flies for Howard Hughes." It's by a man named Ron Kistler. It actually is a terrific book. It seems that Howard Hughes spent every evening sliding. The Hughes Tool Company had a big building out by the Los Angeles International Airport. It had very long corridors with no bins in them. And every night after the janitorial staff had gone around with one of these big drum canisters waxing the floors, Hughes would put on a pair of baseball sliding pads. He'd start up one end of the hall. He'd take a tremendous run. He'd slide on his hip just as if he were running the bases in baseball. And then when he would finally reach the door at the other end of the corridor, he would come hopping up, just like Maury Wills going to second base. You know how you hit it with your foot, and you sit right up. Well, I digress. I digress. Anyway, more recently, Jack Newfield did a kind of collective confession for the entire Village Voice. He went through the files of the Village Voice, and he discovered that since 1980, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, there had been only 4 references in the Village Voice to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 3 of those had been sympathetic to the Soviet Union. One, by Alexander Coburn, said that Afghanistan was a country that deserved to be raped. Now, the 4th reference was value neutral. It was a kind of objective report about something or other. Now, Newfield said that this was inexcusable, that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was one of the worst acts of repression and oppression since the end of the Second World War, and that no publication, whether on the left or any other part of the political spectrum, could afford to close its eyes in the face of what had gone on. And he went on in some detail to excoriate the Soviet Union for its role in Afghanistan. But you could tell as he began to write and got deeper and deeper into listing the sins of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan that he began to realize that this might look as if he were also criticizing socialism and Marxism, Leninism. And so he began to back and fill in one way or another to avoid creating this impression, till finally he reached his peroration, in which he said, "In my mind, The Soviet Union is part of the right, not the left. Its oppression of domestic dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, its miserable role in Poland, its invasions of Afghanistan, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, all make it seem like Ronald Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover have ruled Russia. And that is why no one should cheer the rape of Afghanistan. Actually, I love that. That's terrific. You see what he's. If I were going to choose two people as the likely rulers of the Soviet Union during the invasion of Afghanistan, who were not in fact rulers of the Soviet Union, I think I would probably pick Lenin, who, after all, coined the word concentration camp and built the first big ones, and Stalin for obvious reasons, or Stalin and Khrushchev, who invented the Berlin Wall. But I think for Jack Newfield to have done that, to choose those two people like that as the two who are ruling the Soviet Union, who in fact are not ruling the Soviet Union, would be to indicate that perhaps there was something wrong with socialism, with the very nature of the regime, with Marxism-Leninism. And that is what is inexcusable today. You cannot make that. You have to sever that subject. The interesting is, it's perfectly all right to excoriate the Soviet Union, and he does that in no uncertain terms. He holds no brief for the Soviet Union. He couldn't have denounced it in much stronger language than he did. But you have to sever the subject of socialism, of communism, of Marxism-Leninism, because it's really so Philistine to bring it up. It puts you in such bad company and such bad odor to do it. So the severance is done. An even more graphic example was the night in which 3 years ago, in which Susan Sontag made her famous statement. This was a particular evening and a meeting in Town Hall in Manhattan of many leading intellectuals in New York and from other parts of the country, who met to denounce, and this, I mean, you have to get this, what I think is the subtle point here. They met to denounce the Polish government's oppression of the solidarity movement after martial law had been brought to bear, and so on. Now, speaker after speaker denounced the Polish government, but not as a communist government. But they denounced the Polish government, in order to show they were not denouncing Marxism-Leninism or communism or socialism. They went out of their way to say that the same thing could happen here. It can't happen here. He believes, because intellectuals were a free-floating stratum, and Marx had said that, that they not only would not attach themselves to any class, but they would, because of their free-floating status, would have objectivity. Since they were not attached to a ruling class, not attached to a rising working class, they would have objectivity. I think the whole history of intellectuals over the last 100 years shows that that was in fact not the case. But David Reisman also had a similar theory when he talked about tradition-directed people, other-directed, other and inner-directed. Thank you. See me struggling. People. He said, but there is also, and this chapter is very seldom remembered. He said there is also a creature that I think of as the autonomous man. And the autonomous man is in the fortunate position of having independence from these various outer and inner and tradition directions. Of course, what he meant was me and my friends are the autonomous. So I tend to be a little skeptical of these formulations that make people like the writer. Although I mean, it's a very interesting book that this. I think he's a very gifted writer. But I think these formulations tend to be a little bit self-serving. I don't think people should promulgate theories unless they also apply to themselves. That's one reason I admire Freud. Freud was very rigorous about that. He wouldn't present a theory unless he could also turn it upon himself and find it believable. I did the best I could. Yes.
Mr. Wolfe, one of the things I've always been impressed about in your writing is that you're able to maintain such a sense of humor in the face of what what to me is just an enormously depressing spectacle of contemporary intellectual life, particularly the willful blindness in the face of the manifest evil of communist regimes, but that kind of willful blindness out of slavishness to fashion. But you seem to be like Mencken in being able to find great joy in and humor in what is otherwise a kind of a black situation. I'm wondering how much of that is due to your having, like you said, you're a Pollyanna, you're optimistic. I mean, do you see this fashion falling apart, coming to an end, or I mean, do you see the possibility of intellectuals turning away from fascination with Marxism or whatever species of totalitarianism is de rigueur at the time? I mean,
Well, I think the reason I probably am, say, more hopeful than someone like Jean-Francois Revel is that most of these phenomena do not take a particularly desperate form in the United States, partly because we are insulated from Europe in a lot of ways, and because it does take on so many of the attributes of sheer fashion. I guess for that reason I tend to find it amusing. As I say, I am a bit Pollyanna-ish about it. I'll give you an example. In this country, we actually have had very little terrorism on the part of American radical groups as compared to French and Italian radical groups. And I think the reason is there have not been ideologues in this country in the sense that there have been ideologues in those countries. And it's only when you have the real Flemish bonding of the ideology that you create the kind of religious fervor that leads to a real terrorist mentality. We've been spared a lot, in part because we are one of the few countries that, perhaps along with New Zealand or maybe Australia, that have had no tradition of patriarchy, of a real feudal aristocratic rule, and a lot of the resentments that exist in other countries I don't think have existed here in quite as severe a form. But I still think, who was it, Richard Weaver, who said ideas have consequences? Well, ideas still have consequences here, but it's more in the creation of a muck rather than a grave, it seems to me. But these could be famous last words, I suppose.
Mr. Wolfe.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, I'm a nonfiction writer myself, and I read with interest your profile of Bob Noyce, the Intel president up in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And the word I got on that was that you flew into town and spent about an hour or two with Mr. Noyce, and took a cab back to the airport and left. I really enjoyed the piece, but I was sort of shocked when I heard that, because you being a sort of architect of the new journalism and so forth, which advocates total immersion in your subject, spending time with the person, and I've read a lot of your earlier writings and so forth. That sort of shocked me, and I wondered if that report was not founded, or whether you found that you can size up someone much more quickly today.
Yeah, I become much more powerful as I get older, I can do these things. Unfortunately, the report is true. This was supposed to be a 2,000-word piece. I was in the 50th anniversary issue, in which 50 people who have changed the American life were selected, and I was assigned Noyce, which is something I wanted to do because I knew nothing about computers in that entire world. I did it at the last minute, And I did go. I guess I spent 2 hours with Noyce. I did talk to some other people. I didn't get right back on the plane. I took the red eye. No, I did stay a couple of days. I really didn't do nearly the work that I would have done if I were going to write a long piece. Now you say, what are you talking about? It's one of the longest pieces I ever read. Boy, was it long. I didn't have time to write a 2,000-word piece. I mean, it's so hard to write a good 2,000-word pice. I was the last minute. I ended up writing this enormous manuscript. I think it had some good. It was a real essay. It was not really a piece of reportage. It was really an essay. It had a good thought in it. It just went on a bit. And I think anything that long, particularly coming from me, who has trumpeted this business of the new journalism for so long, you expect to find a much graver. I'm not going to go on excoriating myself. What do you mean? But the other people get paid to do that. Yes.
I was interested by I was interested by the whole talk, but one small statement caught in my mind, and that was you made the claim that Lenin invented the term concentration camp. Where I went to school, and you will judge by my accent where I went to school, the British took this term as their own, having come from the concentration camps that they formed in the Boer War.
Now, you may recall I said that Lenin created the first big, I meant to say fully efficient concentration camps in the sense, but I realized that there had been these camps during the Boer War. I did not realize, and I stand to be corrected if it's true, that the term concentration camp was used at that time. My source for Lenin's authorship of that term is the Gulag Archipelago. That was Solzhenitsyn's, what Solzhenitsyn maintains. Certainly in the sense of concentration camps that are also extermination camps. I think we can credit Lenin.
Yeah, my question was, do you make a distinction between an anti-intellectual group of army officers who kill people by neglect and the concentration camps of Marxist-Leninists or fascists in which people are killed by intention?
Well, I do think there is certainly a difference between a program of extermination and the kind of neglect, however horrible, that you find in prisoner of war camps, for example. In the American Civil War, there were two of the worst camps, one in the north, one in the south, that you could possibly manufacture. I do think there is a moral difference between those two things in my mind. There may not be a moral difference to someone who's been through it, but I would say there is a moral difference.
Mr. Wolfe, an individual like William Buckley has been in the public eye media for quite a long time. Just within the past year, maybe 2 years, George Will has become a regular commentator on the ABC network. I've noticed in the past year the author Arno de Borgrave has appeared on a lot of talk radio shows. He's now an editor of a newspaper that's out of Washington. I think what I'm trying to ask is, do you think there is an intellectual or a growing intellectual opposition to the clerisy which you spoke about today? And could you maybe elaborate on individuals like this who are in the media, who are advocating a different line publicly, who at least give credentials that make themselves appear as intellectuals?
Well, there is a growing group of rather heterogeneous people who are now thought of as neoconservatives. Newspaper columnists are nothing to go by, however. Newspaper columnists, by and large, have always been conservative. I mean, predominantly, because the owners of the newspapers are. That really hasn't changed very much. And the people that you mention, however much one may admire them, cut very little ice within the intellectual world, and in terms of their influence among writers, artists, and teachers generally. When you mention Buckley, Borshgrove, and George Will. But there is what is now coming to the fore are people who just, for whatever reason, were so clumsy as not to have grasped the orthodoxy of the 60s and 70s. They're usually now called conservatives because they didn't go along with the ordinary line. I went to the 25th anniversary party of the National Review. You mentioned William Buckley. It was held at a hotel, the Plaza Hotel in New York. About 700 people there. A reporter came up to me and said, "Mr. Wolfe, would you characterize this as a Klan meeting of the neoconservatives?" First I asked him, "How do you spelling Klan?" And when he said he was spelling it with a C, then I answered the question seriously. I said, "I think what you see here are a few hundred people who, most of whom have never seen each other in their lives, but who share the common stigma of having been incapable of seizing and bringing to their bosom gracefully the ideas that reigned in the 1960s and 1970s. I think it's hard to classify those who have not gone along with the reigning attitudes. They have more influence than they used to have, but I don't think they are by any means equal contestants yet. I mean, this could all change, but it'll take a while. It'll take a while, I think. Yes.
A contemporary historian from the University of Chicago has said that we need more agents and, I'll turn it around. We need less labels and more agents. And
what kind of agents do you mean?
All right, meaning people who are looking for the good of the people, no matter where they are or what time they live in, that we need less labels and more agents for the good of the people. I'm sure that's what you're looking at because we love your sense of humor and your love of the people. Well, what do you propose, for instance, since you spoke of the government of Nicaragua or El Salvador, for the good of those people, given that we don't want regimes there that will simply support the elite?
Well, as I mentioned, I really have no agenda for Nicaragua and El Salvador. But since you raised the question of what positive path would I suggest, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, it may be an impossible dream, but it's certainly no more impossible than the idea of eliminating weapons throughout the world. That's also can be called an impossible dream. The impossible dream that I have is that all nations would become democracies, because in the last 200 years since democracy began as a form of government in the world, no democracy has ever waged war on another democracy. To me, something for all Pollyannas to bear in to bear in mind.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Wolfe, as a student at UCLA and an American citizen, I must say that I didn't find your comments to be a gaffe or rude at all. I find it to be part of the intellectual drizzle at the moment, and that maybe if it would have been 7 years ago that you would have made this speech made tonight, it might have been in poor taste, and I find it hard. You've sort of fallen from sort of the position that I had you as a social gadfly and a great writer.
I've fallen?
Yeah.
My dear fellow, I quite agree with you, but what are we two against so many?
If I can just stray a little bit from the talk, we've heard a lot about yuppies, so-called new class, new social and economic force, and I'm wondering what if you think the yuppies are for real, that is the term properly applied, and given their imputed social and economic force, what significance is there in the fact that their favorite board game is Trivial Pursuit?
I don't think there's anything new about the yuppies. I think people with greed and ambition are a constant in every society. What is different is the level of inhibitions about expressing these things. It was very hard to express one's greed and ambition during the 1960s, if you were educated and cultivated, and maintain respectability. Today it's perfectly possible. You know, it's just sort of. I think that is the change.
Mr. Wolfe, I must agree with you that I've noticed in literature and cultural circles, I've seen this kind of Marxist overture that you've been talking about. Also, there are also people, I believe, who are intelligent, a Marxist or let's say a leftist position, out of a true concern for society, and who have something to say and who maintain a certain debate within society. And I would ask of the kind of argument making tonight is a return to something of Joe McCarthy's era, where you have that whole.
I tried to be very specific. Of course, people have differences of opinion, whether they're called left or right or whatever. I'm saying that to have that debate, everyone has to be willing to look certain occurring. And the big obvious fact that I'm talking about is the existence of a organization. That's what Marxism, Leninism is. Marxism is the ideology. Leninism is a very effective system of organization for the seizure, maintenance, and exercise of control. And I think what I'm saying is to get rid of this diffidence about dealing with this subject. Next time, if you don't believe me, next time just pick up the newspapers when you look in the letters columns and see that very important and central subject. Of course there should be debates. I'm not questioning sincerity. I'm questioning intellectual fiber. That's what I'm talking about. Yes.
Oh, to change the subject a bit, given your own visual resemblance to a piece of postmodern architecture, we're curious what your opinion is of that movement.
Just now you have me curious as to which particular piece you mean. I hope it's tall, sturdy, and powerful. Postmodernism is a kind of avant-garde to the rear. The postmodernists in architecture and in painting, late 1920s. In painting back to the German Expressionist period in architecture. It was what I think of as the first modernism. But there's a problem in taught to draw. Drawing was considered needed was a straight edge and a pencil. Even curved lines were outlawed as bourgeois. 1920, the Bauhaus decided that curves were bourgeois voluptuosity. That was the term, and they all became straight. So why go through this torturous exercise of learning how to do China wash shadings and renderings of classical no longer necessary? Now that there's a kind of rediscovery of the past, now that artists are around for rejected styles of the past, they find them but they can't draw them. That's quite literally true. They can't draw. I think by another 10, 15 years, it's already beginning to be taught more and more in these schools, that we will have architects and artists who can draw. At that point, they will be able to create new forms Now there's an attempt to resurrect old forms that can be done with a straight edge. Look at Michael Graves' furniture sometime if you don't believe me. He's considered a good artist. All of his furniture are things that can be done with those lucite templates you get at the art store. And those templates have straight lines, circles, little tiny circles. They don't even have French curves on them, you know. Everything that he does can be done with that lucite template. And that's true of practically all of these artists. They simply can't draw. So we're in of the 20th century is being created right now. You know, if you have a taste for camp, save in the year 2020 when people begin to look back on what has done, the young talent is going to want to do something requiring greater technical.
As an aspiring writer, it's a great opportunity to ask a couple questions, and I want to sort of ask three quick anecdotal questions and one sort of heresy question. So the quick ones are, the last lecture I went to from a well-known writer at UCLA was Hunter Thompson, and you were the only two writers that ever made me laugh out loud while I was by myself when I was reading your writing. So first question is, what do you think of Hunter Thompson's writing? The second one is, what do you consider the key to doing what you do, or somebody who wants to be a writer? Is there some advice? Three, is there one, you've had such a diverse career of subjects, is there anything that's really your favorite? The Right Stuff, the Artificial Acid Test, was one of those. So those are the three quick ones. And the other one is, I read the book Radical description of the fashion of sort of leftist politics now, and the thing that kind of shocked me recently, there was a headline in the LA Times about headline, and on the corner is another article about 65% of the students out of ghetto high, to worry about that 65% of the students, which is just, to me, as obscene as what's going on in South Africa. Should I repeat those, or you got it?
I think I have had part of it with Radical Chic. It was also fashionable, and much more fashionable in the late 60s, early 70s. I think that's why democracy is not nearly as activist and right. Too much drudgery, too much legwork, too many committee meetings. On the subject of Hunter Thompson, you know, it's one of the great. I think he'll be remembered as one of the perhaps the greatest comic writer of our times, and it'll be interesting what he does next. I think he's at a kind of crossroads in his career right now. He's done. There was a piece he wrote not long ago in Rolling Stone. I think it was about the Super Bowl or something, and it started off in a very un-Hunter. Goes on until then. There's a break in the space, and then the next paragraph begins. What's happened to old Thompson? Kind of the juice has gone out of him, and he suddenly starts commenting on what he's just written, and so that's always worth watching. If I had to point to one ingredient that would be bias because of my own career, it would be reporting. I think it's the thing that is emphasized least, let alone in literary studies. I think it should be a part of. I mean, reporting is, and it's not that it's at the heart of not only great nonfiction, but at the heart of great Dostoevsky knew it, and at the heart of drama. You have to make things look right than from out of journalism.
The other one was your most enjoyable subject.
I like best as a piece of writing is Radical Chic. I just think it technically, stylistically, and so on. As a overall piece of work, you have to believe your last big piece was the best, otherwise you...
I thoroughly enjoyed your talk, and my experience of most of the people I work on are right on the mark. Just two real quick questions. Could you comment on where 8 years ago S seemed to be the thing? I'm not quite sure where we're going now. I'd be curious to hear your comments on that. Between news and public affairs and entertainment, and the best example is just a few days ago in movies about farming, spoke before some agriculture committee to give their slang and so forth, and Sally Field could not be there, so Jane Fonda had a statement from Sally Field about agriculture.
Stuff. That's what I call information ricochet, in which there really does, there ceases to be any line between the media and real life, and it's a very common thing. And it actually is, somewhat in the Bernard Goetz case. At the outset, Bernard Goetz was every man. He was this Mr. Joe Average who happened to be on a subway, and he wasn't going to take it anymore, like the figure in the movie Network. I'm damn mad, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And he pulls out a .38 and settles the issue right there. As long as he was every man, he was in great shape. Then information ricochet began to happen. He could not resist, as none of us can. I mean, I'm a great one to talk. He couldn't resist the opportunity to spout off and to be a celebrity. And he started commenting on the criminal justice system, on the Mayor Edward Koch of New York, and a lot of other things. At this point, he lost his everyman status, and the public didn't turn against him particularly, but this public began to get queasy about Bernard Goetz, and he really became a victim of information ricochet. It's hard not to, but I think certain people know enough to do that, and others don't. I mean, Howard Hughes was actually very smart, never to talk to the media. He became a much greater figure, a figure of gigantic proportions by keeping his mouth shut and never showing his face. I think if he had ever been on the first talk show, it would have been the end of Howard Hughes. I mean, what could he have possibly said to live up to the impression that he created by saying nothing? The age belongs mainly to monomaniacs, but there's also something today for being a minimomaniac that has it. But I think that it was a priceless moment. The movie farmers in front of the really quite baroque. You put your finger on a mother lode there, I think.
One congressman from Kansas said, "As much as I'd like to, I don't have time to play Hollywood Squares." So he actually did. He was the only one that actually saw the reality of it. But could you comment on where things are going in terms of the consciousness with things like Est in the past and what's happening now?
Well, the religious movements, and I consider Est a religious movement, have by no means died. They're not talked about as much. But I think this thing that I have in the past called the Third Great Awakening is still occurring. It's still building. Exactly where it's going to go, I really don't know, but I don't think we've seen the end of it. And people show an uncanny ability to convert almost anything into religions now. Weightlifting. I mean, talk to serious weightlifters and let them tell you about the white moment and things of this sort. And of course, runners. We know about runners, swingers. I mean, it's just. But there is this. There is an ability to convert almost anything into religion these days. I think that's something that has not run its course. Right now, I think we're in answer to the question about the yuppies, we are in a period in which educated people are much more frank about non-spiritual things, and much less inhibited by the need to appear spiritual. People are making money hand over fist in certain areas, and they're spending it much more ostentatiously than they would have in the 70s. People are buying, young couples will buy these houses built in the 20s and 30s that were abandoned as white elephants in the 50s. Now they don't make them big enough. Servants' wings, sure, we've got servants. Let's do it. Birthday parties for the children in which you you bring in carnival rides and hire carnival workers to run. Sure, why not? It's a thriving little industry. It's a time very much like the 20s. This is not to say that it ends in a crash of the stock market, but it's very much a period, I think, like the 1920s in that respect. Just a couple of more.
I'm sorry to break from this apparent UCLA tradition of asking 1,000-word questions of incredible
well, you can be excused.
Tediousness.
That's an out-of-towner.
But I've been dying to know, whatever happened to Gorley? Did he ever file his story on Fidel's sex life?
God! I knew that it was hard for me to believe, but something told me I had left a loose thread in this seamless talk that I just gave. As a matter of fact, I caught up with Gourlay in England a couple of years later. It turned out that he had not been put in jail, but he had been told that he had 4 hours to leave Cuba. They confiscated his travel checks. He had a plane ticket. Was all he had left. And he said, "But my ticket is for London. There's no plane to London until tomorrow morning." And the agent of the DIER, the Cuban FBI, looked at his watch and he says, 3 hours and 58 minutes, sir. I would advise you to go someplace else. And to which Gourlay said, "Well, Jamaica's not a bad spot. I think. It's nice this time of year." And so he left, and he was actually not thrown in jail. And after they went on to found 2 magazines, one of which sank. Very colorful figure. Sorry about not bringing the history of Logan Gourlay up to date.
I just feel kind of lopsided about it. I mean, you've rightfully skewered the left wing in these issues, the left intelligentsia, if you want to call it for that. I mean, I'm going to talk, I'm wearing $36 running shoes, but, somehow I feel like the right wing is just as blind to these things. I mean, the right wing is blind to what's going on in Argentina or what was going on in Chile. It still is. It doesn't see these things. It ignores it. When you read George F. Will, it just doesn't come across. And I mean, am I wrong to say that you're not giving equal time as far as satirizing the right wing, or?
Well, the right wing has so little influence on the subject of the talk actually was the clerisy. Perhaps I didn't make that clear. The subject was really the clerisy, and the right wing really has so little influence on the life of what I think of as a clerisy that there's very little place in that discussion for that. I mean, I think the right wing, and there really is no right wing intelligentsia when you can think. Well, you could say there is. I mean, you could. I mean, there. But it doesn't have. It's not an integral intelligentsia of any sort. So I don't think I just don't think it comes into the subject. The subject is and the nature of the clerisy is something else. It's another subject, is really what I'm saying.
I see. Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, last.
I was just wondering, when you wrote the electroculant acid test, did most of your information come firsthand, or was it secondhand? And what's up with Ken Kesey? Do you still keep in touch with him? And what kind of guy is Jerry Garcia?
The information was both first-hand and second. I can't really say that I was, if you had to ask me, were you on the bus or off the bus? I hung around the bus a lot. So it was first-hand to that extent. I see Kesey from time to time. I saw him. As a matter of fact, he wrote one of the pieces much shorter and more to the point and more effective for the 50 People Who Made a Difference issue of Esquire. Was it end of '83? I know it was '84, '83. He has written 2 really remarkable pieces, I thought, for Esquire. One about the death of Neil Cassidy, one about the death of John Lennon. Over the past 5 years, which show that anytime he wants to, I think he can write another great book. You hear all kinds of rumors about Kesey, and supposedly he's doing working on a novel about Alaska. I hope that's true. Last time I saw him, he was in great spirits, great form, and seemed to be very happy. There's been a very tragic event in his life. His son, one of his sons, was killed in an accident coming back from a wrestling match in Oregon. The bus crashed on an icy road, and he actually wrote a very moving piece that appeared in the Coevolution Quarterly. Some of you may have seen it, about the death of his son. I think Ken Kesey will be heard from many times again. When I first met Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead was by no means the phenomenon or the kind of institution, the icons that they are today. And Garcia is a very amiable and agreeable, very bright person who told me that originally in Palo Alto on Perry Lane, when Kesey and the whole group of writers were there, Garcia and his group, which were then called the Warlocks, lived communally, as they did, probably still do, were considered the low-rent rednecks of the area. It took even among the hippies, and I would probably more than any other musicians from that period, Garcia and the Grateful Dead have maintained the ethos of the original psychedelic movement, up to the extent of, I don't know if they still do it, but it wasn't too long ago that in their contracts when they went on tour, they would insist that there be 40 gallons of milk as part of the contract. In addition to the money, there had to be 40 gallons of milk because whole families would go on tour. You know, the whole commune would go on tour. There'd be babies galore all over the place, and they needed a lot of milk. Although Kesey always felt that the only genuine Grateful Dead music was done at the acid tests, and that everything after that, all the records, were somehow a little bit tainted by commerce. And he does have a gold mine of Grateful Dead tapes done at those acid tests, in which every string seems to have a vibrato of a 5-foot vibration, that sort of thing. That's the so-called prankster archives, if they don't disintegrate from bad treatment, will be a revelation in the time capsule in the year 2085. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this.